All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to IMMOOC Season 4, Episode 2. We are so excited to have Angela Watson joining us tonight, and we have John Spencer, co-author of Empower, with us as well. So I'm going to let John introduce himself, and then we will get a chance to get to know Angela as well. So John, why don't you tell us a little about yourself?
All right, so I am a former middle school teacher. I did that for a little over a decade, and now for the last 3 years almost, I have been at the university level working with pre-service teachers, and I am passionate about student-centered learning, project-based learning, design thinking, creativity. That's what I really care about a lot.
Awesome. And I know so many people listening are really excited to learn more about that and dig into your expertise in that. So before we do that, I'm going to introduce Angela Watson, and she has an awesome podcast and does a lot to empower teachers and support them in their work. So Angela, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
So I'm Angela Watson. I am a national board certified teacher. With 11 years in the classroom, and I've spent 10 years as an educational consultant and instructional coach. So these days, the majority of my work consists of writing books for teachers. So I'm working on book number 5 right now, which is super exciting. I've been blogging since 2003. So I'd love to share teaching ideas there. I started a podcast a couple years ago that Katie mentioned, which is Truth for Teachers. So that's a big passion of mine too, is connecting with teachers in that way. I also create online PD courses, and probably the best known of those is the 40 Workweek Club. And that is an online community, and it's a course that helps teachers streamline really every aspect of their work and life. So the goal is just to reduce that overwhelm and that constant feeling of like you're working all the time, but you're never really done. You've never really done enough, and really stay focused on what matters. So a lot of different work, but all of it is centered around, making teaching as enjoyable and as efficient and effective as possible. So I'm so excited to be here tonight and talking with both of you, because I know both of you have lots of awesome things to say about that.
Thanks, Angela. We are super thrilled to have you. Again, your books, I can't believe book number 5, such an awesome resource, and I can't wait to dig more into that. And for those of you, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Katie Martin, excited to be here. Going to channel George Couros tonight, and for those, let him know that we miss him tonight. He's traveling and can't join us. And AJ is going to likely join us in shortly, depending on when his flight lands. Turns out his flight schedule is continuing to be challenging for him. So while we're waiting for AJ, and we're going to dig in a little bit, and I want to start, either one of you, feel free to jump in, just really thinking about your roles and as they've changed over time. Both of you in different ways are supporting teachers in their work. How do you see the role of the educator changing, and how do you continue to support teachers in that role to understand that?
I'll let you answer that first.
Way to start us off with a big heavy-hitting question there, Katie. I love it. Let's go right away. So we talk about the purpose of education. For me, I feel like I see it through an equity lens. And Chris Emdin said recently that you don't teach kids activism, you create the conditions that allow young people to imagine a more just world. And I loved that quote so much. I see that as, one of the important things that we can do in our education of children is create these conditions that allow them to imagine a more just world, to recognize problems, to feel empowered and emboldened to take action, to solve these problems that they see, and to construct new solutions that make the world a better place. So when I think about how school fits in to create these conditions that make that imagining possible for kids, not to imagine it for them or to lay out this formula or this step-by-step, and spoon feed it to them, but really to create that space where they can imagine it for themselves. And obviously that's not an easy thing to do, But I think that when we hold on to that vision, when we tap into that larger purpose of equipping kids to change the world, that's really motivating and it's really energizing. And so with everything else that's on teachers' plates right now, when you have a greater purpose like that, it's a lot easier to stay focused on what matters and to help you push through those harder parts of teaching. So I think putting it back in the court with the kids and helping them imagine what the future will look like for them and making their goals become a reality, I think is just really key.
I love that. And thanks for bringing in Chris Emden. And he does such great work to think about our role and how to support diverse kids and think about just really creating a space where all kids are honored. I'm wondering, John, with all of your work in design thinking and really empowering students, how do we do that? How do you support teachers to understand the lives of kids right now and what they need in their own education?
All right, so I guess a few thoughts here. The first being, what kids need right now in education is on some level no different than what they've always needed, right? They need a relationship with a teacher who cares. They need deep thinking. They need creativity. These are not new. In fact, a lot of what we talk about are ideas that Dewey talked about. They're ideas that Rousseau talked about. They're ideas that Quintilian talked about. These are not new ideas, the concept of student-centered learning. So I think on some level, we sometimes get wrapped up in how kids are different, and I'm not so sure that they're that different. And a small example I'll give is you always hear people saying that the culture is getting selfish and narcissistic and shallow and everything. And then if you go to a museum, you see people have painted pictures of food and self-portraits, which is basically like Instagram, right? It's just pictures of food and selfies. So I really think on a profound level, who kids are is not that different. What I think is different is that the world has changed because of things like globalization, automation, AI. And that's the part where I think we're kind of in a unique place where, the rules have changed, but the good news is kids get to rewrite those rules. And so what that means is, we talk about this in Power, it used to be that there was a formula that you behave in school, you're compliant, you do what you're supposed to, you get into college, and then you climb a career ladder. And that corporate ladder used to be dependable, and now it's not. And so now that ladder is a maze. And that's why I think things like design thinking, project-based learning, inquiry-based learning, these things help students navigate that maze so that they are prepared for the sheer rate of change that they're going to experience when they get older.
Yeah, so I just spent the day with teachers in classrooms, and we were doing walks in classrooms and looking at the shift and really focusing on project-based learning and what they've done to support more critical thinking and more collaboration and communication. The things we talk about that we want in their classrooms. And I was really amazed by the reflection of teachers and the change that's happened. They started saying, I was so afraid that my kids wouldn't be rigorous. I was so afraid that my kids wouldn't have opportunities to learn the basics if we only focused on projects. And their reflections were just, the more they trusted themselves and trusted kids as learners to really take the learning and go beyond the curriculum, they found more enjoyment, and so did the kids. So I'm just wondering your experiences and how do you support teachers to really understand this? And how do you support teachers through this process of understanding how to create those experiences in their classrooms? Either one.
So I think for me, what I think about is what are those pain points? What are those things that teachers feel on a regular basis? Because I know I'm a couple of years out of the classroom, but I will never forget the terror of 60% of my evaluation being the test score, right? And so what happens if we try project-based learning and design thinking and suddenly the scores are low, right? Or I still remember the frantic pace in the sense of, okay, how do I make time for this? And so I think a lot of this comes down to starting with a real understanding of the needs the teachers are talking about. And that's where I think like the fun thing is, Angela and I kind of take things from different angles, but we're always finding this intersection, right? So you talked about students changing the world, and I'm like, that is design thinking. It's all about beginning with a place of empathy so that our students are empathetic people. Or, you know, we've had this conversation on Boxer back and forth, so this is going to be fun here. I didn't find that I was not truly able to hit that 40-hour teacher work week place that she talks about until I had switched to a truly student-led, you know, student-centered type of pedagogy. And so the fear was like, it's going to be so much more work to do this and that. And so I think it's important to address those fears. Like the test scores aren't going to go down. The time is actually, you're going to free up a lot of time when you do things like design thinking. You know, actually, you're going to get your life back a little bit. Your students are going to leave the day tired and you're not. And that's not a bad thing. And so I think it's important to begin with that place of, you know, understanding that when teachers are saying, I feel XYZ, they're not complaining. They're expressing legitimate concerns and fears and pains that they experience.
Angela, I would love to hear your thoughts on that. And I think John mentioned the 40-hour work week. And I know people are probably wondering, how do I get that? What is that? What does that mean?
So the 40-hour teacher work week club is not actually about working 40 hours a week. You have to pick a title, right? And like pick their own target number of hours and adjust it every week according to your workload. Club doesn't have quite the same ring to it. So I have to pick a title. That's what it is. It's designed to get teachers' attention because most teachers are contracted to work around 40 hours a week. I was as a classroom teacher. And so when you hear that number 40, it's designed to really make you think, like, wait a second, how many hours do I work? How many hours could I be working? How many of those hours are things that are really impacting kids? And how many of them are things that I'm just doing because it's the way that it's always been done? And I have been so frazzled and overwhelmed that I've never been able to take a step back and really question things and really ask myself, you know, what is the best and highest use of our time? That's really what the club is designed to do, is, you know, to solve that problem of overwhelm by going step by step through every aspect of teaching, grading, lesson planning, setting up your classroom in the fall, each one of those aspects, and really looking for what's going to make the biggest impact on kids. And what are the things that I'm just sort of pressuring myself to do, or I'm doing because I'm doing it that way, or maybe it's just always been done that way. So what are the things that we can let go of to really focus on doing those fewer things better and really focusing on what matters? So, I mean, it's tough. It's not an easy process, and there's no really magic bullet there. But I think that intentionality piece is really, really important. And I know that's something that everyone here is a big believer in, is, you know, innovation with intention. You've got to have your why. You've got to know what you're doing, and you have to have you know, some critical thought instead of just going along with the status quo. Because I mean, the truth is, we're wasting a lot of time. I'm in the instructional day. There's a lot of wasted time, you know, before school, after school, and our planning. There's a lot of things that can be streamlined. And I think we do streamline those workloads. It makes us more effective. As John was saying, you know, a true student-centered classroom, ultimately, you know, you're going to be co-creating with the kids. I think we have to move away from this idea of lesson planning as being something that we do for kids, and then we just walk into the room, you know, and like say, like, hey guys, today. Lesson planning has to be something that we do with kids, not for them. So we have to sort of bring them into this process of iterating, of saying, you know, I have this great idea. I don't know if it's really going to work, but I want to try it out. I think it could be a really awesome way to practice these skills. let's do this today, and then let's talk about afterwards what parts were really helpful for you, which parts didn't really work as well, and use their feedback and their input to help you design the next day's lesson, instead of staying up until 2 a.m. looking for ideas on Pinterest and trying to carry that workload alone. So I so agree with everything John is saying about a student-centered classroom really being the key to streamlining that workload, because a lot of times we're just going to work for the kids, and it's stealing the struggle, it's stealing the learning from them.
Yeah, and I just, to piggyback on that, like, you know, I'm going to give like an example that's both from Empower and then not from Empower. So I'll start with an example not from Empower. I used to watch when I taught self-contained 8th grade, so I was teaching all subjects, and that's a lot of prep time, and I would watch certain teachers spending a crazy amount of time decorating, right? And my students would just staple up their work when it was good onto bulletin boards. Like, our bulletin boards weren't pretty, but they were perfect. They just had student work. And then everything else we had was just student artwork that they'd done in their art class, and that I framed and we put up on the wall. And so it didn't look like a traditional classroom. It still looked very, very nice. It looked pretty, but it wasn't like this insane amount of time that went into. I mean, I'm talking, some of these teachers were putting in 10 to 20 hours in decorating. And I don't mean that to mock them. I'm just saying, like, that's a lot of time spent decorating. The second example, though, that I think of is like assessment. I would say 90 to 95% of the assessment that I did in the classroom was in the moment. So student conferencing, peer feedback, and self-reflection, self-assessment that went on. And we get into this in Empower. We have a specific chapter on assessment. But the cool part of that is when the principal would walk in and ask kids what they were working on, they could tell you what they were working on, what standard they were trying to master, where they were on their mastery, and what their next steps were. And that was me not taking homework to grade, right? Like, that's what I mean when I say I think that there's this fear of losing control that happens, that leads to perfectionism, that leads to burnout. And when you're willing to let go of some of that, then you find that teaching is fun, and that there's more time.
I love that, John. And I just, both you and Angela, those examples, and it goes to, like, we keep adding on more to teachers' plates. But I would also say teachers keep adding on more expectations of themselves. And in a world that we see this beautiful classroom on Pinterest, and, you know, there's some people who are really great at decorating and it's their passion. But I would agree, my first classroom, I tacked up some fabric on bulletin boards and left them completely free for kids to design, because it was more interesting to me to see what they put up than to spend my summer putting up all these things about me. I wanted it to be a classroom that we co-created. And I don't know that that's always understood, because we see these beautiful classrooms and people who decorate them, and they think that we have to do that to kind of step up. So both of you brought up this notion about letting things go and, like, turning over some of the process to students. So I'm wondering, what else are things that we need to stop doing in education to really allow students to take some ownership? What other things can we stop doing?
Well, I'll speak, you know, to follow up on what you just shared there about the decorating and, you know, sort of taking things on that we don't have to do. I think that if you really like to have a beautiful classroom and that's important to you, go for it. But there's always an opportunity cost there. And every time that you're saying yes to one thing, you're saying no to something else. So that's really the goal here, is to really think about how we're spending our time. We have a limited amount of time, all of us. So what could those 20 hours be spent on if they weren't spent on that? So, you know, as important it is to create a classroom where you feel comfortable and where you feel like it's warm and welcoming for kids, we always have to be thinking about, you know, sort of that trade-off. And I think that, you know, another area where I think about, you know, teachers maybe taking on more than they need to is assessment. And that's another place where I feel like giving kids more ownership would be really powerful. I think assessment is a really underutilized strategy. I think it's something that, you know, it can be really scary to do. And one of the first things that I normally hear when I talk about it with teachers are worried about kids cheating or not assessing themselves accurately. And I think it's really important to just let's reframe. Instead of thinking about all the things that could go wrong, let's think about the benefit of assessment is kids being able to identify their own mistakes, their own strengths, to see how they're growing. Like that, the process of self-assessment alone, I think, is really powerful. And I think that as we have kids do more of that. So for example, if you have a rubric for a project or something, instead of you filling out the rubric, have the kids fill it out first. They can fill it out in pencil, and then you can write your comments and circle where you think they fall on the rubric in pen right there on the same piece of paper. So you're saving paper, you're putting the responsibility for the learning in the kids' hands instead of you doing it all themselves, instead of you doing it all yourself. And then all you have to do is go in and add to what students are saying and continue that conversation that they've started. So I think there's a lot of things like that when we start looking at more student-centered terms, it becomes easier to envision ways to save time, because we're letting go of that old model where we prepare the work, we give it to the kids to do, and then they sit there and wait for us to give it back. They take a look at it, crumple it up, throw it in the garbage, and that's the end of it. So the more that we're involving kids in these processes, the better. And I would say, assessment and grading practices are one of the biggest ways I think we can give kids more ownership and sort of take some of that workload off of ourselves.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's a great example. And I would just also ask teachers to think about that whole evaluation and assessment process. The most impactful assessments of my own learning are when I take ownership. And I just think about teacher evaluations, when teachers get to say, look, here's what I'm doing. Here are some examples of what I'm doing to meet this rubric or to meet these indicators, rather than a principal coming in for 30 minutes, so evaluating on what they see at that point in time. Teachers always tell me it's not fair. They didn't see the whole thing. And so involving the learners, the teachers, anyone in that process to say, look what I'm doing, is so much more powerful and so much more holistic. And I think your point about cheating, it just made me think about this. Like, we think we don't want kids to cheat, but if they're actually changing their answers, I know this might not be popular with everybody, but imagine kids getting some feedback, changing their answers because they understand what the right answer is now. That's actually more investment than they might have sometimes when someone grades their paper and they never actually look at the right answer. They look at the grade and throw it in the trash. Actually changing the answer and cheating, they might learn something in the process. I'm not advocating cheating. Don't take my words the wrong way. I'm just saying, we think about when kids actually have some ownership, their learning is so much richer. So, and I just think that's, to both your points, like that takes some things off of teachers' plates instead of continuing to add more and more. Something I want to bring up, and this is in Power, John, and it's actually one of the blog prompts this week. Student choice is at the heartbeat of ownership and empowerment. How can we have more opportunities for this in classrooms? So I know people are really thinking about this because it's a blog prompt, and I'm kind of wondering your thoughts on that and what you have to share.
So I really think, part of it is where, I guess I would say, like, one of the things we got into this in Empower that I did when I first started empowering students, and this was after we did our documentary project. I did an audit over the course of the summer, and I asked the question, what am I doing for students that they could be doing for themselves? And some of that was procedures. Some of that was, like I said, decorating, things that we didn't get into in Empower that I realized I had been doing myself, that was I was spending a lot of time on. And then a big part of it was that kind of, in the area of learning and assessment. And so we already kind of got into assessment, but I think one of the things that was really helpful for me was looking at the standards that I taught and asking, where is the choice built into this? So for example, if you have concept standards, there is choice built into the concept standards because they can often choose the format that they're learning. They can choose their approach. They can choose their process. I almost said process. I've been around Canadians and it's rubbing off on me. I said resource the other day. George would appreciate that process. But, you know, I actually wrote a blog post on this in the area of project-based learning, which is basically where do you find the loose and the tight within your standards. So in inquiry-based learning, you can often find standards that are topic neutral, but have very specific skills that you have to practice. In a Genius Hour project, for my Genius Hour, I didn't have 20% time to give up in my classroom. So I would do these geek out blogs and they could choose whatever topic they wanted, but we actually hit almost every single ELA Common Core standard because the skills were tight and the loose was the topic. So I think kind of asking yourself from a large perspective, where is their choice inside of your systems, and kind of do a choice audit, and then in actual standards asking, you know, what is the loose and what is the tight. And the surprising thing for me was there were all these things that I thought you just had to do, that there were no guidelines. Like there was no rule that I had to teach To Kill a Mockingbird in 8th grade. Everybody else did it. They'd been doing it for years, but maybe the kids could choose to read their own books. Like there were other options out there. And so just getting back to it, I really think like the failure of student choice in my classroom was a failure of imagination. It was a mindset issue, not a policy issue.
That's a really good point. And I think we address that a lot, is that we think this has always been done. And so I'm going to continue to do this. And, you know, growing up as a student, I've mentioned this many times, I hated to read certain books because it was always, you have to do this. But really, there was no written rule that we had to do it. It had just been kind of passed on in tradition. And it was what had become expected. And so I'm wondering, Angela, how do you address that? And what are some ways that we kind of break that expectation and start thinking about making more informed choices about what we do with our time, both in our own practice as educators, but also in the classroom with students?
You know, I agree with John that the mindset piece is more important here than the policy, and that a lot of times it's the mindset holding us back. And what I've discovered from my work with teachers, you know, the 40-hour teacher workweek club is being used in over 12,000 schools at this point. So I've talked to a lot of teachers about this. And the obstacle that I see, that I observe from them, is that they just don't have time to reflect. They don't have time to, you know, even think back on a lesson at the end of the day. I mean, even just taking one of the most practical, actionable things you could do is just take a couple minutes at the end of your lesson or end of the day and just jot down notes about what went well, didn't go well. Because you're not going to remember a year later when you teach it again, right? You know, keep notes for yourself, have those kinds of records. And then when you do a similar activity again later, you know, you can learn that and not feel like you're constantly reinventing the wheel. But I think finding that time to really step back and think about what's working and what's not can be really tricky. And I would say another piece that I think is very time consuming for teachers is this sort of self-imposed pressure to reinvent the wheel. Going back on was saying earlier about like sort of this belief that kids these days, you know, have the short attention spans and they're so different and they need all these different things. So therefore I have to have like the most exciting lesson in the world, and I can't possibly do the same thing with them twice because then they'll be bored and they'll, you know, they won't pay attention. And I would say that one of the best things that you can do as a teacher is develop this core group of activities that are open-ended and naturally differentiated, and you can sort of plug them into your lessons over and over. So instead of having to constantly be looking for something new, have this tried and true repertoire of, you know, it might just be 5 or 6 things as a new teacher, and then slowly you add over that over time. But just things that kids really enjoy, that are meaningful for them, that really help them learn, and stop trying to reinvent the wheel. So I would say, you know, stop looking for the next new greatest thing all the time and spend more time thinking of what's working and why it's working. so that you can do more of those things instead of, you know, constantly looking for something new. Because chances are there's already stuff doing that's all, but you haven't really had time to process the awesomeness and figured out what made it work so well so that you can replicate it.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, like one of the lessons for me was to shift from always creating my own assignments to creating my own templates, right? And then templates could be modified. And, you know, one of the examples was if you walked into my classroom and kids were doing silent reading, there were, you know, we were spending 35 to 40 minutes of silent reading, and every student is doing some type of thing where they are practicing a standard that they have not mastered yet. So making inferences, clarifying questions, whatever. And there's an end of the reading activity. There's an activity that they do briefly before the reading and after the reading. And if you look at it and you're like, oh my gosh, there's 37 people doing, you know, all of these different things, and how like that's a lot of lesson planning, but that's for an entire year, right? Because they're going to select whichever ones they need for the entire year and going back to that. And the same thing happened when we used a lot of the same rubrics for writing or for problem solving or for whatever. And what they did is they made things familiar. They made things approachable. It meant that you didn't have to reteach a structure. And so that actually allowed them to make the content and the learning exciting rather than, hey, here's novelty in the form of a new cooperative learning activity. And so, you know, we basically had 7 cooperative learning activities. And I know there were tons of structures we could have chosen, but a pair share would work. So that's what we did. And so I think, like just to reiterate kind of what Angela said, having some familiarity there won't mean kids check out. It actually creates a sort of familiarity that makes them feel safe.
I love that. And I think what both of you touched on is this notion of, like, in a lot of work that we do is like protocols and teacher development, thinking about using protocols to structure the conversation. And more often that leads to innovation, because you have parameters and ways to think about the work, and it allows you to delve deeper into critique and revision or better understanding the work, rather than focusing so much on the actual structure and always creating something new. And I think that's a huge shift to be able to understand. As teachers or leaders, we often think that we have to have all the answers. We often think that we need to be the ones to bring all the excitement to a space, instead of creating the context to really allow for learners' ideas and questions and to emerge. And I think, I know one thing, of course, design thinking is a great process for that, and allows people to really understand ideas. So, and I know people are super excited to hear, I always get questions like, how do you use design thinking in the classroom? So John, I'm going to pick on you to kind of elaborate a little bit on, like, what are some tips? You know, you wrote a book, you have some ideas. What are some tips for how to use this in the classroom?
So one of the things that that I'll point out is, you know, I wrote a blog post on this whole idea of, you know, design thinking can work in any subject. And if you look at that blog post, there's also a link at the very bottom where you just put in your email, and I'll email you the whole design thinking toolkit. And so it comes with 2 sample projects, a tiny house project and a create a sport project, where you can kind of see what it looks like in math and see what it looks like in ELA. And it also comes with a lot of the assessments that I mentioned, the student conferencing system, the peer conferencing system. We do a 10-minute peer conference system that worked really well. And so I'll just point that out ahead of time. If you want to dive in a little bit deeper, you know, check that out. And it's kind of a great entry point. There's also there is a beginner's guide to design thinking, where I kind of walk systematically through what the design thinking process looks like. But I think the big thing to understand about design thinking is that it is used all over the place. And so I remember having a conversation, and there was one person who was an engineer and another person who was an owner of a record company, and the three of us are talking, and they asked me, what is this design thinking that you were talking about in the classroom? I started describing it, and this person interrupted me and said, no, that's the engineering cycle. You don't understand. And the other person was like, no, that's not the engineering cycle. That's the product market cycle. That's exactly what the product market cycle looks like. And so it was a reminder that design thinking is kind of the shared language of what good design looks like. And as we think about having kids become makers and architects and artists and engineers and all of that, and learning to think like that, navigating that maze, being empowered, it's kind of a process that allows them to get the most out of creativity. And again, it works in different subjects. We would do like the eco-friendly kitchen project in science. In math, we did a tiny house project. We did a board game creation project. For social studies, it was often documentaries and blogs and podcasts and things like that. But it was also, a service learning project where students kind of came up with a solution using design thinking to graffiti, and they actually ended up painting murals in our classroom, and not in our classroom, throughout the school. So it is something used in every subject. It's something that fits into a lot of different industries. And even though it might seem a little daunting at first, I think that once you see it for yourself, you're going to think, oh, I've already been doing this, or I've been doing some of this, but I could try that. And to me, that's the exciting part of it.
Yeah, I love that. And really what you just said, like, I could be doing more. I think that that's something for teachers that once we get past the, I should be doing it perfectly, or even leaders, anyone as an educator, and instead, how could I tweak this to better meet the needs of the people and the learners I'm serving? That is a huge focus. And again, I was reminded of that today with educators who instead thought, I'm being defensive and I should know all of this already. The most authentic and inspiring educators are really saying, gosh, what do I need to learn, or what do I need to do to really better understand those that I serve? And I feel like that is the heart of design thinking, or really human-centered design. And at the core, I feel like that's what we're doing as educators. We're designing for the people in our classrooms. We're designing for the people in our schools. And that is when we start to see that ownership and that agency, which is at the heart of just awesome learning. So we have time for a few more kind of conversations, and I'm going to start asking the people who are watching to start posting some questions to Twitter. So if you have questions for Angela and John, start posting them, and I will get to them momentarily. But I do have another question for Angela. You piqued my interest when you said, I think 12,000 schools that you've impacted with your course. I'm curious, what are the things that you're hearing from teachers? What are the challenges that they're facing, and what are the strategies for overcoming those challenges?
To narrow it down to the biggest things. I'll talk about the things that I feel most passionate about addressing, and I think it's a lot of the stuff that we've hit upon here. It's just the overwhelm that comes from trying to do everything and trying to do it all perfectly. And is this mindset that it's not okay to fail, that I need to be figured out before I go into the classroom and do it. And I totally understand that, because, there's a lot riding on teacher evaluations, and, not every to, help teachers take risks and, to be reflective on what they're doing. But I think that when we take that step back and we really focus on what matters, the priorities become a lot more clear. And I think that one of the most important things we can do is really take that overwhelm seriously, because it leads to burnout. If not, I think for so many people, busy is just the new normal. And so we just kind of accept this is just that this is your life, and it's especially just the life of a teacher. If this is the job you're doing, then you're just stuck working super long hours and being exhausted all the time. And it just is like there is a better way. And I think that some teaching jobs are much more demanding than others. So it's not to say that the end result will be the same for everyone, but certainly I think all of us, self included, have to constantly be looking at what can we do to stay focused on the most important things, because balance isn't something that you can just achieve once and for all. It's something that you have to be constantly revisiting, because there's always new demands on your plate, right? As soon as you figure out, okay, you know, this is what I'm doing this week and I'm create time for this, I'm not going to create time for this. Well, the next week is different. And so then, you know, it can feel like you're starting over at square one. But when you recognize that it's just an ongoing journey and it's something that you're going to be constantly evaluating, it sort of takes the pressure off, because you don't have to find this one right way. You don't have to have it all figured out once and for all. You can just say, okay, this is what's working for me and my family and students right now. And then next week we can reevaluate. And, you know, just being afraid and being not afraid to take risks and to try something new. Even you're not really sure what the path is, just experiment, because you don't have to feel exhausted and overwhelmed all the time. And when you really start to prioritize yourself and really start prioritizing about so much more of an effective teacher, because you're bringing all that energy and enthusiasm to the classroom. So really everybody benefits. It's not selfish to step back and think about, okay, what's actually going to be sustainable for the long term.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think when you talk about balance, I'm reminded of AJ in one of these IMMOOCs mentioned, he was like, balance is overrated. And at first I thought, no, everyone's supposed to achieve balance, which I appreciate. But I think that we need to think about what balance means for us personally. We sometimes think it's like 50% work, 50% home, or whatever that is. But really, the balance can be very personal and what makes sense to each individual. And it doesn't have to be something that we feel like we're fitting in somebody else's norms. I am a person who likes to work a lot, and I'm really passionate about my work, as probably most people watching this. And so some of the things I do, I write for fun. I blog, and that's something that is enjoyable for me. But I also love to go to the beach. I love to be outside and, you know, do things with my kids. But if we start getting into this perceived norm of what we're supposed to do as people, I think it can be daunting as well. And so I really appreciate that notion that it's personal and we have to make changes and choices, and it constantly evolves. So John, unless you have any comments on that, we have a question from the Twitterverse.
All right, let's take the question.
All right. So our question is from Rich Violanti, and he's asking, how do you help promote pockets of innovation within a school, moving them into accepted norms?
So I think a few different things. One is it has to be grassroots, but it also has to be top down, right? Like, we need leaders to embrace this. And sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes you get into this thing where people become administrators because they're really good at discipline and parent communication, and then they go from being APs to being principals, and their mindset is very compliance driven, fear driven, and not innovation driven. And so I think, like I would say, you know, first of all, we really need good teachers who desire innovation to become educational leaders. And we need principals to empower their staff to do that. We need to trust teachers. The most innovative person I worked with looked very hands-off. But in the process, he was constantly finding opportunities to empower the people that worked for him. It was my friend. I call him a friend now. It's funny, but he was my leader, Chad. And then there was another guy, Mike, that was like that the same way. So I think there has to be that leadership piece where the leader is inspiring and empowering things. people. The second thought that I have is we need to allow people to own their journey. So sometimes when we talk about creativity and innovation and things like that, we push too hard, and it becomes the equivalent of the person that overexercises for a week and then just quits it altogether, right? And we need to let people own the journey and celebrate that. So you know what? That person is still doing traditional grading and is still assigning homework, and you could name all these things that might not be your jam, but the reality is that person just allowed their students to blog, and that's a celebration. So celebrate it. And so that's the other thing, is I really think we need to allow them to kind of own their innovation journey. And the other piece that I think is, the pockets of change. I kind of, the visual metaphor I have of it is that we need to allow those small pockets to expand and then spark little tiny other ones. And then what happens is you have kind of an ink blot, right? And so an ink blot looks like it's a bunch of little drops until suddenly it's all together. And so I kind of view it that way. Like instead of trying to make the person doing innovative things, suddenly change policies and train everybody and this and that, allow that person to impact the people immediately around them and then grow and then pilot things, and then you get kind of this ink blot effect. That is a really tough question, though. I love it. And I took a stab at it. I have no idea if I answered it well.
I think it's perfect. I mean, we're all addressing this question. And John, I actually love that you said, like, it's a tough question, and not saying like I have the right answer, but rather this is a tough question we're all trying to address. And some of my thoughts on that are around, building on what you said, strengths and celebrations. Too often in school, we focus on deficits and things that aren't going well, but that's really not a great way to build people up and to empower them. And so when we think about what are things that are going well and how can we build from there, instead of beating people down, I find that I feel like we spread things much quicker. I mentioned a few times just being in classrooms today, people were so excited. They're like, I do that. They're validated. So, one of my main strategies is start opening up classrooms. This notion of perfection has come up a lot tonight, and we get in our heads a lot and think what the person next door is doing and the other teachers are doing, and we can't live up to that. And as soon as we walk into real classrooms with real kids and start to see what's happening, we start to see, oh, they have challenges just like me, or they're approaching this a different way. And we start to see that innovation spread and like the community be built with people starting to trust one another. So I think just opening up classrooms and getting to see one another and really talking about what's actually happening in classrooms is one of my favorite strategies to move from pockets to school-wide change. Angela, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I like that strategy of having that community, of seeing what's actually going on in other classrooms, because I think we do have this idealized version of what other teachers are doing, and we assume that everyone else has it all together and we're the only ones who don't. And it's very refreshing to see, okay, no, everyone else is struggling with this too. We're all trying to make our way and just experiment to see with what works.
So I have a really different question, but good question. Another challenging one that we're all working on. So this comes from Daniel Welty, and he's saying, how do you deal with student apathy when trying innovative teaching and students would rather have a worksheet or a PowerPoint? There's a lot of takes on that one.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a blog post that I wrote on that called like 8 ways to start with self-directed learning or something like that, because this is something that I hear a lot from teachers where you check all the innovative teaching boxes and you put it before kids and they are confused because it's a lot of work to design your own learning and to take charge of what you're learning. I think it's tough for kids, and sometimes we underestimate how tough it is for kids to be told on one hand, you know, we want you to, you know, design this project-based learning experience, and then in the next class period, then they're filling in bubbles for a multiple choice test, because we have these two, you know, sort of competing visions of what it means to educate kids happening right now in our schools. You know, and I think it must be very hard for kids to switch back and forth from that mentality where, you know, it's very compliance based and you need to just get the score on the test, to moving into project-based learning and things like that. And I think the scaffolding is really, really important. And I'm sure John will speak more to this, but you know, the student choice element is obviously really important too. We've got to sort of ease kids into these experiences and support them along the way, and sort of recognize that the challenges that come from switching back and forth like that. And I think the more that we can give kids the opportunity to pursue something that they're interested in and sort of hook them in the beginning, and then slowly release more responsibility to them later on. So it's not something that we can just say, oh, kids should be able to do this, or, you know, just because it's student-centered that all the kids are going to be super invested in it. It doesn't necessarily work that way. And just because someone else's kids were really invested in it on Twitter doesn't mean that your kids are going to be too. So you've got to be really connected to your students and really understand their personalities and what their specific needs are, and work from there.
I would agree. I think when I see student apathy and there's a really cool project, it's almost never apathy. It's almost always fear. And it's almost always fear about it not working, or fear of being unsure of what to do. It's uncertainty. And so, you know, I found a few things made a huge difference. One is providing plenty of scaffolding for students along the entire way, but making the scaffolding optional. So you give them the agency where you say, hey, we have sentence stems. You can use them whether you're ELL or not, because some kids don't come from a language-rich background, even if they're not ELL. And so they choose the scaffolding, and they're learning how to find resources and asking, what do I know, what do I not know, and how do I find it? And I actually model that metacognition process the first time, because you actually have to give scaffolding on how to find scaffolding. And I know that sounds funny, but it's super helpful. And then the other thing is changing the structure so you do everything you can to reduce the fear. And so one of them is time, and just saying, hey, look, you have all the time in the world to get this done. You have plenty of time. There's a whole thing about compacting and telling students, if you already know a standard, you can skip it so you have more time. And you just really focus on, you have time, you have time, you have time. And then the other fear would be kind of their fear about like the low grade. And so allowing them to know you can always redo your work. I'm not going to average the two. It's whatever your highest grade is, that's what you've mastered, that's what you get. And when those pieces are in place, what I found was, if the scaffolding was there, if they could choose it and they knew how to choose it, then the fear was gone. And then it was purely a question of motivation. And the motivation thing was sometimes an issue. There were times where I was like super stoked about a project and the kids just didn't care. And so in those moments, I would just have to say, okay, we're switching projects. I wrote about this in a blog post. I did a project I thought would be really cool, where they would have to find linear equations in real life. And they were like, this is stupid, this is dumb, and it didn't work. It just was a bad project. And so that will happen. And if I would say this, like if the whole class is hating it, it's probably a bad project. And you can cut your losses and move on. There's nothing wrong with that. But if they're not afraid, and you generally know what motivates them, and you're giving them plenty of choice, in my experience, most of the time, I had really high engagement.
Super awesome examples. And I will just add on to this. I just moved. I'm in the middle of a hotel lobby, so sorry if it's a little loud. I know my lighting is fabulous. But I just, you know, I wrote about this in the book, that just because we all of a sudden say, I'm going to empower students and make time in our plan book, doesn't mean all of a sudden that
they know how to do that, or that they've been trained, and a lot of times all through school, to play the game, go through the motions, rewarded for that. So it is a conversation, and it does mean that you need to kind of talk to kids and think about what you expect, and really bring them into the process. Just all of a sudden, like, hey, we're going to all of a sudden own our learning today. A lot of kids are like, what do you mean? These aren't the rules I'm used to playing by. So we have to understand that kids are caught in the middle between educators who are trying new innovative practices and some that aren't, and really understand the world that they're living in, and also what they're held accountable for. So I'm going to ask one last question. It's getting loud in here. Everyone's coming in. So my question comes from Marsha Moore Sirkin, who I have never actually met, but just adore her. And she's a great coach and really involved in, I see her a lot on Twitter and shares a ton. So her question is for both of you, whoever wants to go first. Question for the panel: what is your elevator speech to convince exhausted educators to begin an innovative path with students? Be sure to include resources. So this is your final prompt.
I want to answer first because I know Angela's going to have a really good answer, and then I won't have an answer. So I just want to say my pitch for them is, I almost always tell them my own story. I actually created a sketchy video on this of the day I broke up with Busy. And what I get into is the notion of the what happens in school where we convince ourselves that Busy is better. I mean, I used to watch teachers brag in the staff lounge about being late and being there early, and mock teachers that were leaving early, and realizing, like, that's crazy. That's wild that we brag about this stuff. And so what I love to tell, the conversation I would have with teachers all the time was, on a personal level, breaking up with Busy meant I was less stressed. I was enjoying my job more. I was less likely to snap at my class, because the busy times, the perfectionist times, those were the times where I would shame a student, or a few different times I even yelled at a class, which is embarrassing. But the other piece is, in the process, I became a better teacher. And that's a really hard thing. Like, yes, it's about self-care, but it's also about student care. You know, the whole push towards student-centered learning for me coincided with breaking up with Busy. Those two were interrelated. So, all right, Angela, I'm going to let you answer this, because you're going to do that better than I am.
No, that's pretty darn good, John. And that video, by the way, I haven't seen that. It's an amazing video. You know, I would say if there's a teacher who is too busy and overwhelmed to really innovate, I would say start with the thing that's not working, right? Like, that's what I say to teachers when I do instructional coaching in schools, and they're like, well, I'm not really into this. I don't see how it's going to fit into my day. Okay, so what's the aspect of your teaching that really isn't going as well as you want to? Something that's taking up way too much time. The kids hate it. They're disengaged. You don't like teaching it. What is that aspect? Because we all have that, right? Like, we all have lessons that we dislike. We have units and subjects that we're just not crazy about. There's procedures that aren't working well. So what aspects of your teaching and kids learning isn't working as well as you would like? And then how can we figure out a better way? How can we streamline that? How can we get rid of something that's not working and replace it with something that is more innovative, more engaging, that gives kids more choice? And I think starting from that angle, instead of, let's go through and just transform all your teaching, and let's just, plug this in on top of everything else that you're doing. Okay, what's the one thing that you're doing right now that you don't want to keep doing it that way anymore? And start from there. And I think it's baby steps. Vicki Davis has said, innovate like a turtle. And that's one of my favorite quotes when it comes to this kind of stuff, is it doesn't all have to be done overnight. So go at your own pace. And, hopefully teaching will be a marathon and not a sprint for you. Hopefully it's something where you're going to continue to become more intentional, more innovative over the years. And it's not something that you have to master this year. You don't have to use every single idea this. So pace yourself and innovate like a turtle.
Innovate like a turtle.
Those
it's a good one, right?
It's so good, both of you. And I know that like just breaking up with busy, both of those, like you guys just nailed. It was a long elevator, but both of you guys just nailed that.
Yeah, awful images.
We were going to the penthouse, which is cool. I thank you guys so much. And I just want to say for me, my short elevator pitch is really thinking about your experience as a learner. What is it that resonates with you? What is it that makes you most passionate and empowered as a learner? And why wouldn't we want to create those opportunities for kids? And, you know, going back to so many teachers who say, once I just like got over myself and just like took a step back and figured out what my kids needed and really just like took more structures away, the better things became for the teachers and for students. So both John and Angela killed that answer. I don't need to reiterate it, but I just want to say thank you for everyone who tuned in tonight. Angela and John, please go to their blogs, websites. They shared so many resources tonight, and I'll make sure to tweet those out. But thank you. We have a great week coming up. We have the Twitter chat on Thursday, which is always fast and furious, and we have Allison Apsey Facebook Live on Wednesday. Keep blogging, keep sharing. Remember, this week the challenge is about gratitude. Thank people who have supported you in this journey, and continue to do what you do and make a difference for kids. Thank you so much. John and Angela, thank you so much for being here. We had a great night, and thanks for all you do.
Thanks, Katie.
Thank you.
All right, good night.